In the sweltering heat of July 2025, the southern Syrian province of Swida, long a pocket of relative stability, erupted into a maelstrom of violence. What began as localized tensions spiraled into a full-blown tribal civil war, pitting local Druze militias against Sunni Bedouin tribes. This was not a simple clash of neighbors. The conflict was deeply complicated by outside forces. Some of the Bedouin groups were reportedly allied with the Syrian government, turning a regional dispute into a proxy battle with devastating consequences for everyone involved. The fighting was fierce and unforgiving, spreading rapidly across the arid landscape that the Druze called Jabal al-Druze, or the Mountain of the Druze. It was a conflict that shattered the delicate peace that had been carefully maintained for years. The reasons for the sudden outbreak were complex, rooted in a mix of historical grievances, economic pressures, and political maneuvering. For years, Swida had existed in a state of semi-autonomy, with local Druze factions managing their own security. However, this arrangement was always fragile, dependent on a delicate balance of power. The trigger for the July conflict was a series of escalating confrontations that quickly moved beyond the control of local leaders. The involvement of government-affiliated forces transformed the dynamic entirely. It was no longer just a tribal issue, it became a direct challenge to the Druze community's long-held independence and a brutal reminder of their vulnerability in the turbulent landscape of post-war Syria. The fighting that ensued was characterized by its intensity and brutality. Reports from the ground painted a grim picture of towns and villages becoming battlegrounds overnight. The militias involved, both Druze and Bedouin, were well armed, and the clashes quickly escalated from small-scale skirmishes to sustained combat involving heavy weaponry. The conflict was not confined to remote areas. It spilled into populated centers, endangering civilians and bringing daily life to a grinding halt. The very fabric of society in Swida was torn apart as neighbor turned against neighbor, and ancient community ties were severed by the ferocity of the violence that swept through the province. The conflict represented a catastrophic failure of the delicate social and political order that had allowed Swida to avoid the worst of Syria's decade-long war. The Druze had managed to carve out a space for themselves, navigating the treacherous politics of the region with caution and skill. But the events of July 2025 demonstrated that their autonomy was not guaranteed. The swift escalation showed how easily simmering tensions could be exploited by larger powers, dragging the region into a conflict that served interests far beyond the borders of Swida itself. The civil war became a brutal lesson in the precariousness of their position and the high stakes of their survival. The human toll of the four-day civil war was staggering, leaving a deep and lasting scar on the Swida province. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a respected monitoring group, the conflict claimed the lives of nearly 600 people. This number included both fighters from the warring militias and innocent civilians who were caught in the crossfire or targeted directly. The violence was indiscriminate, and homes, farms, and businesses were destroyed, leaving a trail of devastation. For a community that had largely been spared the scale of destruction seen elsewhere in Syria, the sudden eruption of such intense fighting was a profound shock, plunging the population into a state of fear and mourning. Beyond the grim statistics of the dead, thousands more were left with life-altering injuries. Hospitals and local clinics, already struggling with limited resources, were completely overwhelmed by the influx of casualties. Medical supplies dwindled rapidly, and doctors and nurses worked around the clock in harrowing conditions to save lives. The conflict also triggered a wave of internal displacement, as families fled their homes to escape the fighting, seeking refuge in safer areas within the province or with relatives in neighboring regions. The economic life of Swida, which relies heavily on agriculture, was brought to a standstill, with crops left to rot in the fields and supply chains completely severed. Perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the conflict was the evidence of targeted atrocities. Reports emerged of brutal field executions, with at least 86 Druze civilians allegedly killed by government-affiliated forces. These acts were not random casualties of war, but deliberate and systematic killings designed to terrorize the population. In the chaotic aftermath, there were also reports of revenge attacks, with at least 3 Bedouin civilians reportedly killed by Druze factions. These brutal acts of retribution fueled a cycle of violence, and deepened the animosity between the communities, making any future reconciliation incredibly difficult and leaving a legacy of bitterness and mistrust. The psychological impact on the people of Swida cannot be overstated. The sense of security that the Druze had fought so hard to maintain was shattered in a matter of days. The violence left a community traumatized, grieving, and facing an uncertain future. The bonds of trust that had once existed between different groups in the province were broken, replaced by suspicion and hostility. The conflict was not just a military event. It was a profound social and psychological crisis that would take generations to heal, fundamentally altering the identity and outlook of the Druze community and their neighbors in southern Syria. To understand the crisis in Swida, one must first understand the Druze people themselves. They are a unique and often misunderstood religious and ethnic group, with a history stretching back over 1,000 years. The Druze faith originated in the 10th century as an offshoot of Ismaili Shia Islam, but it has since evolved into a distinct religion with its own sacred texts and beliefs. Central to their faith is the concept of the transmigration of the soul, or reincarnation, where the soul is reborn into a new body after death. This belief shapes their worldview and their approach to life and community, fostering a strong sense of collective identity and destiny that binds them together. The global Druze population is estimated to be around 1 million people, with the largest community residing in Syria, primarily in the mountainous Swida province. This region is often called Jabal al-Druze, or the Mountain of the Druze, a testament to their deep historical roots in the area. Smaller but significant Druze communities also exist in neighboring Lebanon and Israel, as well as a growing diaspora in countries around the world. Their society is traditionally divided into two main groups: the Ukal, the initiated religious elite who have access to the secrets of the faith, and the Yuhal, the uninitiated majority who lead secular lives but adhere to the community's moral and social codes. One of the most defining characteristics of the Druze faith is its secrecy. The core tenets of their religion are not shared with outsiders, and they do not seek or permit conversion. This practice, known as taqiyya, or dissimulation, developed as a survival mechanism, allowing the Druze to protect themselves from persecution by outwardly conforming to the dominant faith of the lands they inhabited. This has contributed to their reputation as a closed and enigmatic community. Furthermore, the Druze practice endogamy, meaning they only marry within their faith, which has helped preserve their distinct cultural and religious identity over centuries of turmoil in the Middle East. The Druze have always played a significant role in the politics of the region, far outweighing their relatively small numbers. They are known for their fierce martial tradition and a strong desire for self-governance. Throughout history, they have navigated complex political landscapes by forming strategic alliances to protect their autonomy. Their loyalty is typically given first and foremost to their community, a principle that has guided their actions and decisions through the rise and fall of empires and the shifting borders of the modern Middle East. This history of resilience and pragmatism is central to understanding their current predicament at the crossroads of Syria, Israel, and the wider world. The Druze community's relationship with the Syrian state has been complex and has evolved significantly over time. Under the rule of the Assad family, both Hafez and Bashar, the Druze maintained a delicate and pragmatic arrangement. They were granted a degree of semi-autonomy in Swida, allowing local militias, such as the prominent Rijal al-Karama, or men of dignity, to handle internal security. In exchange, the Druze largely stayed out of the Syrian civil war that began in 2011, refusing to send their young men to fight for the regime against the opposition. This neutrality was a strategic choice, aimed at preserving their community and avoiding being drawn into a conflict that they saw as not their own. This careful balancing act was tested when extremist groups like ISIS began to threaten Swida. In these instances, Druze militias cooperated with the Assad regime to repel the common enemy, reinforcing their role as a capable and reliable security force in southern Syria. This cooperation, however, was always one of convenience rather than deep-seated loyalty. The Druze leadership skillfully used the threat of extremism to solidify their autonomy, creating a buffer zone that kept the worst of the war at bay. For years, this strategy worked, allowing Swida to remain an island of relative calm in a sea of chaos. but it also fostered a sense of separation from the rest of the country. Their relationship with Israel is equally nuanced and has been shaped by geography and politics. In the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights, a territory captured from Syria in 1967, the Druze community has largely maintained its Syrian identity. Despite being offered Israeli citizenship after the annexation in 1981, the vast majority have refused it, holding on to their Syrian passports and their cultural ties to their brethren in Syria and Lebanon. This has created a unique community, living under Israeli control but remaining emotionally and politically connected to Syria. This cross-border identity has made the Golan Druze a key point of connection and concern for all sides. In contrast, the Druze community within Israel proper, numbering over 150,000, are full citizens who have integrated into Israeli society. Uniquely among Israel's Arab minority, Druze men are subject to mandatory military service and have served with distinction in the Israel Defense Forces. This has created a covenant of blood between the Israeli state and its Druze citizens. This complex web of relationships, semi-autonomous in Syria, loyal citizens in Israel, and Syrian nationals in the Golan, meant that when the civil war erupted in Sweda, it sent shockwaves through Druze communities across the entire region, pulling them in different directions and testing their loyalties like never before. As the violence in Sweda reached a fever pitch, the Druze religious leadership made a momentous and difficult decision. Faced with overwhelming force and the massacre of their people, they formally requested military intervention from the Syrian interim government, now led by President Ahmed al-Sharaa, who had come to power in 2025. This was, honestly, a dramatic shift. For the first time in years, the community that had prided itself on its self-reliance was forced to ask for protection from the central government in Damascus. The arrival of the Syrian army marked the end of Sweda's de facto autonomy and brought the region back under the direct control of the state, a move that was met with mixed feelings of relief and apprehension. The intervention of the Syrian army set the stage for a tense and complex diplomatic effort to end the bloodshed. A fragile ceasefire was eventually brokered between July 17th and 19th, 2025, not by local actors alone, but through the mediation of major international and regional powers. The United States played a key role, with U.S. envoy Tom Barrack leading the negotiations. He was supported by a coalition of nations including Turkey, Jordan, and other Arab states, all of whom had a vested interest in preventing the conflict from destabilizing the sensitive border region. The ceasefire was a testament to the high stakes involved, as the fighting in Sweda threatened to draw in multiple external actors. The terms of the truce were carefully negotiated to de-escalate the immediate crisis while addressing the underlying power dynamics. The agreement stipulated the withdrawal of Syrian army forces from within Sweda's towns and villages. In their place, internal security was to be handed over to appointed Druze factions, a concession aimed at restoring some measure of local control. However, the Syrian state would maintain its presence through the establishment of General Security Service checkpoints on the outskirts of the province. This arrangement effectively reasserted Damascus's authority over the region's borders while allowing the Druze to manage their own internal affairs, at least on the surface. Despite the agreement, the situation remained tense. The ceasefire was met with skepticism by some prominent Druze leaders. Sheikh Hikmat al-Hijri, a key figure in Sweda, publicly distanced himself from the final agreement, even while acknowledging that it was a necessary step to stop the killing. His hesitation reflected a deep-seated mistrust of the Syrian government and a fear that the truce was merely a temporary solution that did not address the root causes of the conflict. The involvement of Lebanese Druze leader Walid Jumblat in the mediation also highlighted the cross-border nature of the crisis, underscoring that the fate of Sweda's Druze was a matter of concern for the entire community across the Middle East. As the Syrian army advanced into Sweda, alarm bells rang loudly in Jerusalem. The movement of Syrian forces towards the Golan Heights was seen as a direct threat to Israeli security. For the first time since the 1974 disengagement of forces agreement, the official Syrian army was approaching the Israeli border. This development effectively ended the 50-year period during which the Druze of Sweda had served as a reliable, informal buffer for Israel. In response, Israel launched a series of airstrikes against Syrian military targets, including a dramatic and highly visible strike on the Syrian Defense Ministry in Damascus, sending a clear message to the al-Shara government. Prime Minister Netanyahu's government framed its intervention as a moral obligation to protect the Druze community, with whom Israel shares complex ties. He publicly pledged that Israel would not stand by while the Druze were being slaughtered and vowed to keep southern Syria demilitarized. However, Israel's support was carefully limited. Despite receiving direct requests from Druze leaders in Sweida for ground support and weapons, Israel declined. Its involvement was restricted to the air, a calculated move designed to deter the Syrian army and enforce a de facto buffer zone extending up to 80 kilometers from the Golan, without getting entangled in a ground war. This limited intervention placed the Israeli-Druze relationship under considerable strain. While the airstrikes were welcomed by some in Sweida as a necessary intervention, others felt a sense of betrayal. They had hoped for more direct assistance in their moment of existential crisis, and the refusal to provide ground support was seen as proof that Israel's actions were driven more by its own strategic security interests than by a genuine commitment to protecting the Druze people. This perception damaged the quiet, informal partnership that had existed for years, leaving many Druze feeling that they had been used as a pawn in a larger geopolitical game. The Israeli actions drew a mixed reaction from the international community. The United States, while not openly criticizing its ally, cautioned Israel against repeated military interventions that could further destabilize the fragile situation. Meanwhile, regional powers like Turkey and Jordan, who had supported the ceasefire, were critical of Israel's strikes, viewing them as a dangerous escalation. In Damascus, President al-Shara condemned Israel's intervention, accusing it of pushing Syria into a dangerous phase. Israel's response, though decisive, had complicated an already volatile situation, reshaping the security landscape of southern Syria and altering its long-standing relationship with the Druze. The aftermath of the July 2025 civil war has left the Druze community of Sweida in a state of profound isolation. The very actions they took to survive have paradoxically deepened their predicament. Their request for intervention from the Syrian government, while necessary to stop the bloodshed, shattered their cherished autonomy and brought them back under the authority of a state they have long mistrusted. At the same time, their appeal to Israel for help, and Israel's subsequent airstrikes on their behalf, has tainted them in the eyes of many other Syrians. They are now viewed with suspicion, accused of being collaborators with a foreign power, a dangerous label in the fractured landscape of Syria. This dual alienation has placed the Druze in an incredibly precarious position. Their relationship with the new Syrian state under President al-Shara is fraught with tension. The Syrian leader publicly urged Bedouin tribes to honor the truce, but simultaneously blamed armed groups from Sweida for instigating the conflict, a clear case of victim blaming that did not go unnoticed. This rhetoric suggests that while the government was willing to intervene, it does not view the Druze as loyal subjects. The community now has to navigate a relationship with a central government that sees them as both a problem to be managed and a potential fifth column with ties to Israel. Simultaneously, their long-standing quiet partnership with Israel has been severely tested. The Druze community in Sweida felt that the aerial support they received was the bare minimum, a strategic calculation by Israel, rather than an act of solidarity. The refusal of ground support left a lasting sense of abandonment. This has strained the trust between the Druze of Sweida and the Israeli government, and has also created tensions within the wider Druze community, particularly with the Druze citizens of Israel who serve in the IDF. The covenant of blood now feels less certain, as the limits of Israeli protection have been starkly revealed. Trapped between a suspicious government in Damascus and a self-interested potential ally in Jerusalem, the Druze of Sweida find themselves with few reliable friends. The international community, while involved in mediating the ceasefire, has offered no long-term guarantees for their safety or autonomy. The United States has cautioned Israel, while Turkey and Jordan have their own interests to protect. This leaves the Druze feeling exposed and vulnerable. They are a small minority caught in the cross-currents of regional power struggles, forced to navigate their path forward alone, with their traditional survival strategies now seeming obsolete and ineffective. The Druze community now stands at a critical crossroads, facing a set of difficult and potentially dangerous choices that will determine their future in Syria. One path is to seek full reconciliation with the new Syrian state led by President al-Shara. This would involve dismantling their remaining militias, accepting the full authority of Damascus, and attempting to reintegrate into the national fabric. This option offers the potential for stability and an end to the immediate conflict. However, it comes at the cost of their hard-won autonomy, and would require them to place their trust in a government that has already shown signs of hostility and has blamed them for the recent violence. A second path is to continue relying on limited Israeli support, maintaining a degree of separation from Damascus. This would mean trying to preserve their semi-autonomous status and looking to Israel as a security guarantor against future threats from the Syrian state or its proxies. This choice would allow them to maintain their distinct identity and local control, but it is fraught with risk. As the recent crisis showed, Israeli support is not unconditional and is primarily driven by its own security concerns. Relying on Israel would also perpetuate their isolation within Syria, fueling accusations of collaboration and potentially inviting further conflict with the central government and other Syrian groups. A third, more perilous option is to attempt to forge a path of armed neutrality, rejecting both Damascus and Jerusalem. This would involve trying to rebuild their own military strength and defending their autonomy on their own terms. This path aligns with their historical tradition of self-reliance and fierce independence. However, in the current geopolitical climate, this may no longer be a viable strategy. The Druze are a small community, and they are outgunned by the Syrian state and its allies. Attempting to go it alone could lead to a devastating and unwinnable war, risking the very survival of the community and its ancestral homeland. Each of these choices carries significant dangers and no easy answers. The decision is not just a political one, it is an existential one that will shape the identity and future of the Druze for generations to come. The community is divided on the best path forward. Some leaders, like Sheikh Hikmat al-Hijri, remain deeply skeptical of any deals with outside powers, while others may see reconciliation with Damascus as the only pragmatic choice. This internal division further complicates their ability to present a united front, making them more vulnerable to manipulation by external forces seeking to exploit their predicament for their own strategic gain. The future for the Druze of Sweida is shrouded in uncertainty. The fragile ceasefire brokered in July 2025 has paused the immediate violence, but it has not resolved any of the underlying issues that led to the conflict. The province remains a flashpoint, a place where local grievances, national politics, and regional power struggles intersect with dangerous potential. The community must now navigate a landscape that has been fundamentally altered. Their autonomy is gone, their alliances are strained, and their sense of security has been replaced by a pervasive anxiety about what tomorrow may bring. The path ahead is filled with challenges that will test their legendary resilience. One of the key challenges will be rebuilding the social fabric of Sweida. The civil war tore apart communities, creating deep wounds of mistrust and animosity between the Druze and their Bedouin neighbors. Healing these divisions will require a concerted effort at reconciliation, justice, and dialogue, something that seems difficult to achieve in the current climate of fear and suspicion. Without a genuine peace between the local communities, any political settlement imposed from the outside will remain fragile and liable to collapse at the first sign of pressure, plunging the region back into violence. Another major challenge is the economic devastation. The conflict destroyed infrastructure, disrupted agriculture, and brought commerce to a halt. Rebuilding the local economy is essential for long-term stability, but it is unclear where the resources for reconstruction will come from. The Syrian government is struggling with its own economic crisis, and international aid is unlikely to flow freely into a region still perceived as unstable. This economic hardship will only exacerbate social tensions and could create fertile ground for future conflict, as desperate people become more susceptible to recruitment by armed groups. Ultimately, the survival of the Druze in their historic heartland will depend on their ability to adapt to a new and dangerous reality. Their traditional strategies of maintaining neutrality and balancing rival powers have been rendered obsolete by the events of 2025. They must now find a new way to secure their place in the Syria of tomorrow. Whether they choose reconciliation with Damascus, a risky reliance on Israel, or a path of defiant independence, the road ahead will be perilous. The Druze are at a turning point in their long history, and the choices they make in the coming months and years will determine whether their unique culture and community can endure in the turbulent Middle East.
Ready for a history adventure? Join our community. Subscribe to World History, smash that like, share with friends, and drop your thoughts below. Let's make history together. See you in the comments.